Removing and replacing parts. HP ProDesk 2 SFF G2a Desktop PC and G2aE Desktop PC. How to remove the access panel. Locate the captive screw on the rear of the computer. Loosen the captive screw. Slide the access panel toward the rear. Lift the access panel off the computer. How to replace the access panel. Slide the access panel back into position. Tighten the captive screw. How to remove the optical drive. The optical drive can be removed without removing the front bezel or the drive cage. Remove the access panel. Locate the power and data cables at the rear of the optical drive. Disconnect the power and data cables. Pull the tab or connector, not the cable itself, to avoid damage. Locate the green release lever on the side of the drive. Press the green lever to release the drive. Slide the drive out through the front of the computer. How to replace the optical drive. Slide the drive through the front of the computer until it is secured into position. Reconnect the power and data cables. Reinstall the access panel. How to remove the front bezel. Before removing the front bezel, make sure the access panel and optical drive have already been removed. Locate the 3 retention tabs on the front bezel. Pull the 3 tabs upward to release the bezel. Rotate the bezel away from the computer and lift it off. How to replace the front bezel. Place the bezel at an angle to align the tabs with the chassis. Push the front bezel into position. How to remove WLAN module. For this task, you will need a Phillips screwdriver and a flat-bladed tool. Before you begin, make sure the access panel has been removed. Locate the WLAN module on the system board. Remove the antenna protector. Remove the Phillips screw that secures the module. Before disconnecting the antenna cables, note the number label on each cable. They must match the numbers printed on the module connectors. Disconnect the antenna cables from the module. Pull the module straight out of the socket. How to replace the WLAN module. Insert the module into the socket. Secure the module with the Phillips screw. Reconnect the antenna cables. How to remove the battery. For this task, you will need a flat-bladed tool. Before you begin, make sure the access panel has been removed. Locate the coin cell battery on the system board. Squeeze the metal clamp that extends above one edge of the battery. When the battery pops up, lift it out. How to replace the battery. Insert the battery with the positive side up at an angle into the socket. Press it down until it locks. The holder secures it in the correct position automatically. How to remove the hood sensor. Before you begin, make sure the access panel has been removed. Locate the hood sensor at the front left corner of the computer. Disconnect the hood sensor cable from the system board connector. Slide the sensor out of its slot. How to replace the hood sensor. Place the sensor back into its slot. Reconnect the hood sensor cable to the system board. How to remove PS/2 connector. Before you begin, remove the access panel. Locate the PS/2 connector bracket at the rear of the computer. Rotate the release latch to the open position. Disconnect the PS/2 cable from the system board. Remove the connector assembly from the computer. How to replace the PS/2 connector. Place the connector assembly back in its position. Connect the PS/2 cable to the system board. Rotate the release latch to the closed position. How to remove the fan duct. Before you begin, remove the access panel. Slide the back of the duct into the computer. Lift the duct off the heat sink. How to replace the fan duct. Place the duct over the heatsink, then slide its back against the rear chassis wall until you hear a click. How to remove the serial port. For this task, you will need a hex screwdriver. Before you begin, remove the access panel and fan duct. From the rear of the computer, locate the two hex screws securing the serial port. Remove the two hex screws. Disconnect the port cable from the system board connector. Remove the serial port assembly from the computer. How to replace the serial port. Place the serial port assembly back into the computer. Connect the port cable to the system board. Replace the two hex screws. How to remove and disassemble heatsink with fan. For this task, you will need a Phillips screwdriver. Before you begin, remove the access panel and fan duct. Locate and disconnect the fan cable from the system board. Locate the four captive screws securing the heatsink and loosen them in diagonally opposite pairs in an X pattern. Lift the heatsink off the processor. To remove the fan from heatsink, loosen the four Phillips screws securing the fan and lift the fan. Note: thoroughly clean all old thermal material from the bottom of the heatsink and the top of the processor before reinstalling. Replacement thermal material is included with the heatsink spare part kit when purchased from HP. How to replace and assemble the heatsink with fan. Important. When reinstalling, tighten the heatsink screws in the same X pattern to seat the heatsink evenly on the processor. Tighten the four captive screws to secure the heatsink. Reconnect the fan cable to the system board. How to remove the solid-state drive. For this task, you will need a Phillips screwdriver. Before you begin, remove the access panel and the fan duct. Remove the Phillips screw that secures the drive. Pull the drive out of the socket. How to replace the solid-state drive. Insert the drive into the socket. Tighten the screw that secures the drive. How to remove a hard drive. A Phillips screwdriver is required for this task. Before you begin, remove the access panel, optical drive, and front bezel. Locate and remove the Phillips screw from the optical drive cage. Slide the cage toward the rear of the computer and lift the cage out. Locate and disconnect the power cable and drive cable at the rear of the hard drive. Locate the screw securing the hard drive cage and remove it. Pull the release lever toward the inside of the computer. Rotate the drive cage upward and remove it from the computer. Turn the drive cage upside down on your work surface. Remove the four screws securing the hard drive and lift the cage off the drive. How to replace a hard drive. Place the hard drive into the drive cage. Install and tighten the four screws securing the hard drive to the cage. Position the drive cage in the computer and rotate it downward into place. Push the cage into its seated position until the release lever locks it in place. Install the screw that secures the hard drive cage. Reconnect the power cable and drive cable to the rear of the hard drive. Place the optical drive cage into the computer. Slide the cage toward the front of the computer until it is properly seated. Install and tighten the Phillips screw that secures the optical drive cage. How to remove the power supply. For this task, you will need a Phillips screwdriver. Before you begin, remove the access panel, front bezel, fan duct, optical drive, drive cage, and power supply. Locate and disconnect the three power supply cables connected to the system board. From the rear of the computer, remove the three screws securing the power supply. Inside the chassis, press the release lever on the floor in front of the power supply. Slide the power supply toward the front of the computer. Lift the power supply out. How to replace the power supply. Position the power supply inside the chassis. Slide the power supply into its proper position until the release lever engages and locks it in place. From the rear of the computer, install and tighten the 3 screws securing the power supply. Reconnect the 3 power supply cables to their respective connectors on the system board. Verify that all power connections are fully seated and that the cables are routed correctly. How to remove the memory modules. For this task, you will need a Phillips screwdriver. Before you begin, remove the access panel, the optical drive, front bezel, and drive cage. Locate and remove the 2 screws from the memory cover. Lift the memory cover off. Spread the 2 retention clips outward from both sides. The module will tilt up at a 45-degree angle. Remove the module from the socket. How to replace the memory modules. Align the replacement module with the socket, then slide it into the socket at approximately a 45-degree angle. Press the module down until both retention clips snap into place and secure the module. Place the memory cover back into position. Install the 2 screws to secure the memory cover. How to remove the system board. For this task, you will need a Phillips screwdriver. Before you begin, remove the system board, access panel, front bezel, fan duct, heat sink, the optical drive, and drive cage. When replacing the system board, remember to transfer the WLAN module, expansion card, solid-state drive, and memory modules to the new board. Disconnect all cables from the system board. Locate and remove the 6 screws securing the system board. Push the padlock loop out through the rear chassis wall. Slide the board toward the front of the chassis. Lift the back of the board up to approximately 45 degrees. Pull the board out of the computer at an angle. How to replace the system board. Insert the system board into the computer at an angle. Lower the back of the board from approximately 45 degrees into position. Slide the board toward the rear of the chassis until it is properly seated. Push the padlock loop back into position through the rear chassis wall. Install the 6 screws to secure the system board. Reconnect all cables to the system board. How to remove the wireless antennas and cables. For this task, you will need a Phillips screwdriver and a flat-bladed tool. Before you begin, remove the access panel, optical drive, and front bezel. Disconnect the antenna cables from the WLAN module. Remove the cables from the clips on the chassis floor. Remove the 2 screws securing the antennas to the front of the chassis. Remove the cables from the clips on the front of the chassis. Pull the cables out through the holes in the front of the chassis. How to replace the wireless antennas and cables. Route the antenna cables through the holes in the front of the chassis. Route the cables into the clips on the front of the chassis. Install the 2 screws to secure the antennas to the front of the chassis. Route the cables into the clips on the chassis floor. Connect the antenna cables to the WLAN module. How to remove the speaker. Before you begin, remove the access panel, optical drive, and the drive cage. Disconnect the speaker cable from the system board. Deattach the speaker from the chassis. How to replace the speaker. Reattach the speaker to the chassis. Reconnect the speaker cable to the system board.